This talk will be given by Professor Jane Hathaway, who is Professor of History at The Ohio State University. Professor Hathaway has published extensively on the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire, in particular on Egypt and Yemen, and also on the chief eunuch of the Ottoman imperial harem. Her books include The Politics of Households in Ottoman Egypt and The Chief Eunuch of the Ottoman Harem, From African Slave to Power Broker, both published by Cambridge University Press, and the second edition of her book, The Arab Lands Under Ottoman Rule, 1516 to 1800, A Tale of Two Factions, was published last year. Her talk today is on the Cairo Geniza as a source for Ottoman history, ? Just before I hand over to Professor Hathaway, the next talk in our series will be on Thursday, February the 25th at 16:30 UK time, and will be given by Dr. William Kynan-Wilson from the University of Bristol. Dr. Kynan-Wilson will be speaking on Frames and Fashion, Ottoman Costume Books as Material Texts. I now hand over to Professor Hathaway.
Thank you very much, Kate, for that gracious introduction. And I assume you can all hear me. If not, use the reaction bar. Okay, great. So I'm going to start screen sharing now. I have a PowerPoint. And by the way, thank you all for coming. I'm nervous because there are several real Genizaologists in the audience. So I hope you won't be too disappointed. Okay, and you can see that, I hope. Okay, I'll put it on slideshow. Right, before I get started, I want to make sure that I give a shout out to the Bond Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies, who graciously awarded me a Heinz Heinen Fellowship and graciously allowed me to hold it virtually this semester. In fact, I'm missing an informal Zoom gathering for the fellows. I believe there are 14 of us in order to give this talk. You know, Zoom scheduling, there's just too much. So what I'm going to be trying to do today is, first of all, provide an overview of the Cairo Geniza for those who are not already intimately familiar with it. And I think there are probably a number of people in the audience who are not. Say something about the major collections, or at least show a slide listing the major collections. Focus in on the Ottoman era material as opposed to the much better known medieval material. And then I will go to 3 examples of the documents I have been working with. So what I will be doing with those examples is not in-depth analysis, but more of an overview to try and give a sense of what kinds of information they offer and how they can be used as sources. So starting with the basics, what is the Geniza? And before I get to the Geniza itself, I'll start with the building where it was housed until approximately 1896. This is the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Fustat, which today is just a southern neighborhood of Cairo, but which 1,000 years ago was a completely separate town, as you see on this map. The Geniza Synagogue, or the Ben Ezra Synagogue, is approximately here where I've added this little red dot, and you'll notice, if you put your face up to the screen, that it's in the old Coptic quarter of Cairo, and still is. That's where the major Coptic churches and the Coptic Museum are located. It's also the site of an old Roman fortress. The synagogue itself is almost certainly a structure that goes back in its original form to the pre-Islamic era. Its history before the 11th century is kind of vague. And by the way, if you want a very basic introduction to the Geniza and the synagogue, I would recommend S.D. Goitein's A Mediterranean Society. That's like the cornerstone work on the Geniza, Volume 1, Chapter 1. Now, granted, there are other things you could read to acquire familiarity with the Geniza and the synagogue, including Marina Rustow's new incredible book. But if you're looking for just a starting point for getting into the subject, I would recommend starting with Goitein's Volume 1, Chapter 1, and then adding supplemental materials. Goitein was writing back in the 60s. we know much more about the Geniza and about the synagogue, and there's been a kind of revisionist take, a difference in how we view or I should say differences in how scholars view the material as opposed to how Goitein viewed it. In any case, as he points out, the synagogue was almost certainly a pre-Islamic structure. There was a story circulating that in the 9th century sometime, which is under Islamic rule, the Coptic patriarch was in debt and had to sell a church to a Jewish congregation, which probably happened, but it was not this Jewish congregation. So that doesn't explain this synagogue. So pre-11th century status rather unclear. It becomes much clearer in the 11th century because in the first place, the synagogue was raised under the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim. And just to back up a little bit, the Fatimids are the Ismaili Shiite dynasty that founded the city of Cairo as their new capital when they conquered the city from the previous Sunni dynasty in 969. So you can see the original Fatimid city was really their little regnal city for themselves. Fustat was way down in the south at some distance away. Al-Hakim, about midway through the Fatimid period, took the throne and was a very eccentric and erratic caliph. He's considered by many scholars to have been clinically insane. We may never know. At one point during his reign, took stringent measures against Jews and Christians. He destroyed a number of Christian and Jewish places of worship, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and including the Geniza synagogue and most of the Coptic churches. Like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Geniza synagogue, the Ben Ezra synagogue, was rebuilt during the reign of his son. And it was at that point that the Geniza room, which you'll see in the next slide, was added. So here you see the renovated structure after the most recent renovation in 1991. It was renovated in approximately 1890 and then again 100 years later in the run-up to 1992, the 500th anniversary of what the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism called 500 years of peaceful Jewish living in Turkish lands. So here you see the interior in its restored state and a little detail above the ark that's over at this end. So that's the synagogue, the Geniza itself. First of all, the word Geniza is Hebrew for burial. And so what this usually is collection and burial, periodic burial in an actual cemetery of documents, pieces of paper, vellum, parchment, etc., bearing the name of God, and sometimes not even bearing the name of God. It's not terribly unusual for this kind of Geniza to exist in synagogues. Indeed, many synagogues today, including in the US, have Genizas. A number of Muslim Geniza equivalents have also been found, for example, in Afghanistan and in Palestine/Israel. What's unique about the Ben Ezra synagogue, and unique question mark, let's just say it's the only or almost the only known one of this kind, and certainly by far and away the most famous, is that it's, although they did practice burial of documents in a nearby cemetery occasionally, the main repository for these discarded papers, old worn out papers bearing the name of God, was a room actually built into the synagogue at the time of that 1025 restoration after the destruction by al-Hakim. And you see here, this must have been a reenactment for the cameras. This is the opening. It would have been on the second floor of the synagogue. So if we go back to the photograph of the interior, presumably over here. Goitein refers to it in his chapter as a lumber room, but it's some lumber room. You would have had the largest stock of firewood in the known world with this lumber room. It extends 2 stories, the height of the synagogue. And this was where discarded papers, vellum, parchment, etc., were deposited, and it was never emptied. It was never taken out and buried. So for 1,000 years, documents and works of literature were discarded in this space. It wasn't an archive, though, and I want to make that clear. When I'm teaching about this to my undergraduates, I say it was like a recycling bin that was never emptied. And to underline the fact that it was not an archive, some of this paper, even though Egypt is quite dry, some of this paper and vellum ends up in rather messy shape, as you see on the bottom, folded up, wormholes and insect holes, stains, etc. So it can be very difficult even to get apart, much less to read. I've had this problem doing, okay. Fortunately, it advanced. So what happened? How did we find out about the Geniza documents? That has everything to do with this restoration in 1890. At that time, the Geniza room was emptied out. And even before then, as far back as the 1860s, European scholars had started to realize that this trove existed and had begun to collect some of the non-printed material and either keep it or sell it on antiquities markets and the like. But 1890 is the big watershed because that's when the secret is out. And Egypt at the time was under British occupation. So lots of people were coming in and out, not least archaeologists. And there was money to be made from selling some of this material to them. Why non-printed? Well, that's kind of what I would call a paleographic snobism. Non-printed is recent in quotation marks, often 19th, 18th century and later. So it can't possibly be as important. The big watershed, though, comes with a Cambridge Don. Who else? Solomon Schechter, who is important for many other reasons. He's the same Solomon Schechter after whom all those day schools in North America are named. He was on the faculty at Cambridge. He learned of the Geniza, and he wanted to go to Cairo, or Fustat rather, and take what remained of the non-printed material out and take it to Cambridge. It took money to do this, though, and so he teamed up with the master of St. John's College at Cambridge, Dr. Charles Taylor, who was really the amanuensis in this project, and they removed most of the remaining non-printed material and took it to Cambridge, which is why the Cambridge University libraries today have the largest collection of Geniza documents in the world, and the largest single collection within the library is the Taylor-Schechter collection. So you see Schechter here in later life, and then this iconic picture of him in his Cambridge office surrounded by Geniza fragments. I'm assuming that's what Cambridge University faculty offices still look like today. Haha. I promised a slide with the Geniza collections. You can see because of the way in which they were removed from Cairo, they ended up over a large chunk of Europe and even in the US to some extent. Largest collections at Cambridge, Oxford, JTS in New York, and then smaller ones in Europe, in Philadelphia, even in DC. And off the eastern seaboard, there are even a few at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, about an hour and a half south of where I'm sitting now. How does Ohio end up getting this stuff? That's the subject of another talk. You might wonder, how do you go about doing research on the Geniza in a pandemic, or even not in a pandemic? Fortunately, the Geniza is one of the most digitized collections of documents, certainly in Near Eastern or Middle Eastern studies, maybe in the world. There are several major digital projects. Here I've listed 3. The Friedberg Geniza project is like the virtual Geniza. It's like, it really is as if almost the entire Cairo Geniza had been taken out of Fustat and put online. That's a huge exaggeration. But many of us use this repository to find images of our documents, and that's how I've been accessing them. Cambridge, of course, has a very important research Geniza Research Unit, the Taylor Schechter Geniza Research Unit, also online. And Princeton University, the department where I got my PhD, has a very important Geniza project that really is the legacy of the late S.D. Goitein, who at the end of his career was at Princeton. And two people in the audience here, Mark Cohen and Marina Rustow, have directed this project since his death. Okay, so now we're focused in on the Geniza itself. We know what it is, where it is. How many items? That is a matter really of guesswork. Marina Rustow's new book gives the number 400,000 total. Of those items, roughly, and this is very, very, very roughly, 360,000, so the majority, date from this core period between the 10th and 13th centuries Common Era. And by the way, unless I tell you otherwise, my dates will be Common Era. It's the period that Goitein focused on in his pioneering work, A Mediterranean Society, which I will get back to in just a second. And indeed, most scholarly attention, even today, focuses on the material from this period. Goitein categorized this material in two types, literary and documentary. Literary would be things like long lost books of the Bible, rabbinical commentaries, rabbinical responsa, things like that. The documentary material, this is where Goitein really made his mark, because before he started working on this material, most of the attention had been on the literary material, the manuscripts, which were not all in Hebrew. Many of them were, but some of them were also in Arabic, often written in Hebrew script, what's called Judeo-Arabic. Goitein's big innovation was to focus on the documentary material, what in the Gateway course for history majors at Ohio State we call unintentional sources. Things like business letters, court cases, grocery lists, lists of poor people who are lined up to get bread, that kind of thing. Most of this stuff, certainly not all, but most, is in Judeo-Arabic, Arabic written in Hebrew letters. And it's this kind of thing that Goitein exploited as a source for social and economic history. And he published the results of his study. And this is certainly not the only thing he published, because A Mediterranean Society is a post-retirement work. He published it later in life, between 1967 and 1983. He died in 1985. But it really has become the landmark work, the work that people consult who otherwise would have no familiarity with the Geniza. It's in 5 volumes plus a 6th of general indices produced after his death. But it's entirely focused on this medieval material. The Geniza itself continued to absorb pieces of paper throughout the Ottoman period, from the conquest in actually 1517 until Solomon Schechter took the remains of the non-printed material out in 1896. So nearly 400 more years. And yet, so far as we know, and there's a lot we still don't know, the Ottoman era material comprises only a tiny fraction of the overall material, probably about 40,000 items, although who really knows, because so little work has been done on it compared to the medieval material. So how does the Ottoman material differ from the medieval material? First of all, you have a greater variety of languages. You still have Judeo-Arabic. You have a bit more Hebrew. And you also have a new language, Ladino, the Castilian Spanish spoken by the Jews who were expelled from Spain. They are coming into Ottoman territory, including Cairo. And they tend to be, relatively speaking, wealthy, intellectually sophisticated, and so they tend to be dominate socially and economically. And again, it's Spanish written in Hebrew letters. You even find a little bit, a very tiny bit of Turkish. You'll see one of the Turkish documents in just a minute. Fustat had changed a great deal since the Fatimid period. It had actually been burned under one of the last Fatimid caliphs to keep it out of the hands of the Crusaders. So during much of the Ottoman period, it was a relatively poor neighborhood, as it more or less still is. And so you don't have people like Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish philosopher, going to the Ben Ezra synagogue anymore. There's a more impoverished community. The materials, we think anyway, reflect that. Another thing that I've noticed, and I defer to experts in the audience on this, but what Goitein pointed out and what people who work on the medieval corpus know is that the paper and other writing materials on which these documents were written, especially the non-literary, the documentary material, were often reused, sometimes even centuries later. Like you find a court case and then in the margins, 2 centuries later, someone turned it on the side and wrote a list of goods that had come in on a ship. Or as Marina Rustow has found, they even had old Fatimid decrees, and between the lines of the Arabic, someone would write in Hebrew, even turned to the side. It does not seem that in the Ottoman era, this was as often the case. The documents I've examined, and admittedly, it's not very many, it's essentially one text per document, so to say. Reasons for this, the big one is paper was much more widely available, including paper from Europe. There are a number of scholars working on the Ottoman era Geniza, including some who are even in the audience today, which makes me very nervous, but not nearly as many as those who are working or have worked on the core medieval material. So I just want to give a shout out to 3 of the most important scholars currently working on the Ottoman era Geniza, above all, Professor Dotan Arad at Bar-Ilan University, and also 2 at Cambridge, Esther Miriam Wagner, who was co-published with Professor Arad, and Jeffrey Kahn, also at Cambridge. Jeffrey Kahn is a linguist and has worked on both the medieval and Ottoman period documents. And before I get into my examples, I have to give credit where it's due. It takes a karya. It takes a village to, at least for me, to complete a project like this. I will try and give shout outs as I go through the documents, but I have to mention the Princeton people up front, and above all, Marina Rustow, the current director of Princeton's Geniza project and an extremely important scholar of medieval Islamic, above all Fatimid history in her own right, who has been unbelievably helpful and supportive to me. And actually, back in 2016, when I was still trying to finish the Chief Eunuch book and was just contemplating this project, I was at the Institute in Princeton, and she actually identified a number of documents from the Ottoman period that kind of jump-started me on this project. She didn't read them for me, but she did identify them as being from the Ottoman period. So I owe her a huge debt of gratitude. Her colleague, Princeton's junior Genizaologist, if I can say that, Eve Krakowski, back in 2016, was similarly welcoming and was giving a seminar on the Geniza in which she had one of Michael Cook's students, Ekaterina Bukovaya, or Kate as she's called, who actually met with me and showed me one of the Ottoman era documents. That was the first time I had seen an Ottoman era Geniza document. Alan Elbaum, the current research assistant for the Geniza project, I will mention in a couple of minutes. And the others, as I said, I will mention as I go through. So now on to my examples. And I know there are going to be Ottomanists in the audience who say, wait a minute, this is an Ottoman Turkish document, which it is. The TS must really stand for Topkapı Saraya, that is the Topkapı Palace Library, and not for Taylor Schechter. But I promise you, this is actually from the Geniza. It's part of a 2-document set comprising a total of 5 folios in Ottoman Turkish, one of only a few. And when I say few, I mean as in on the fingers of one hand few in the entire Geniza. I should mention that Dotan Arad from Bar-Ilan has published one of the few others. Cambridge University Library has cataloged each sheet of paper as half of a folio. So what you're looking at is folio 1 recto. In Geniza land, they use recto and verso, not A and B, by the way, for you Ottomanists out there. So they've cataloged it as half of a folio, even though quite obviously this sheet comprises 2 non-consecutive pages of a single bound book. This is the correct order. The document to which it is connected is Taylor-Schechter NS 297.51. Now, some of you Ottomanists in the audience may recognize this immediately as a work of Ilm al-How in Arabic. That is to say, a kind of primer or catechism for Muslims and sometimes for converts to Islam, giving you the basics: how to pray, how to fast, how to perform ablutions, what draws you into unbelief. This is a genre that has attracted a great deal of attention in the Ottoman field in the past 10 or 15 years because of its links to confessionalization in the 16th and 17th centuries. And by confessionalization, it's really a term in early modern European history that refers to state sponsorship of public performance of a particular religion. In the Ottoman case, this would mean public performance of state-sponsored Sunni Islam of the Hanafi madhab, or legal rite. Confessionalization and indeed works of Ilmihal have been discussed in important publications by Darin Terzioglu at Boğaziçi University, Diana Kirstic at Central European University, and Guy Barak from the New York University Library. Tiana Kirstic, Professor Kirstic, has helped me out in trying to contextualize this work, as will become clear in just a minute. It's written extremely clearly, with the vowels all inserted, although this is not atypical in works of Ilmihal, but even a rosette separating each word from the others. So this might seem to indicate that it's intended for non-native Turkish speakers, or that it's meant to be read aloud, perhaps both, perhaps even for people not familiar with Arabic script. And that might describe Egypt's indigenous Jewish population who spoke Arabic, but if they wrote it in Hebrew script. So 2 questions: what's it doing in the Geniza, and why is it in Ottoman Turkish? Well, the conclusion one immediately jumps to for why it's in the Geniza is that it belonged to a Jewish person who converted to Islam, although there's no way to be sure. As for why Turkish, one possibility is that the owner was perhaps a Jewish government official in Egypt, and that converting in this context included becoming conversant with Ottoman Turkish. Possibly the person converted on accepting government employ, although as you'll see with the next document, that was certainly not required. Tiana and I did some checking around and concluded that the text is not one of the well-known works of Ottoman Ilmihal. It's possible that it's an original composition. We can't tell because the surviving leaves of the work lack any indication of the date of copying, though I might guess that it's a fairly late specimen, perhaps late 18th century, maybe even 19th century, simply because it is so pristine. So the first 3.5 pages of TS Arabic 153 deal with Shuruti Salat, that is, the rules of prayer, how to pray and what errors make your prayer invalid. And you'll notice this recurring phrase, which I can't, there we go. In this case, sehi vi sejdeh, like a failure of prayer. This is followed by 3 pages of elfazi kufr, words that make you an unbeliever. And these are words intentionally uttered, for example, mocking the Quran, mocking the Prophet Muhammad. Then 1.5 more pages of Shuruti Salat, and the 2 pages of the other document, TSNS 297.51, seem to constitute the end of the work. Tiana told me that among the major Ottoman works of İlmihal, only that of Birgeli Mehmet or Birgeli Mehmet Efendi, famous among Ottomans as the intellectual and spiritual inspiration of the puritanical Kadazadali movement, the 16th century puritanical reformer, only his work addresses both these topics, Shuruti Salat and Alfazi Kuf, although there are many anonymous paraphrases. She also suggested that this document might represent a compilation of sections on these topics from different İlmihal works. I will say linguistically, most Ottoman works of this type use the form secde-i sehiv for invalid prayer, whereas this document uses sehiv-i secde. In modern Turkish, it's sehiv secdesi. Now for something completely different. This is from Philadelphia, from the Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, the Halper Collection 222. And yes, I do realize that I have the recto on the left and the verso on the right, but that's really for presentation convenience. The recto is the Jewish prayer known as Siduk Hadin, which is traditionally recited at burials, usually right after the grave is filled in, and I will get back to that. The verso is a business letter dated from the month of Dhul Qa'dah in 1119 of the Islamic calendar, so that's late January or early February 1708 Common Era. Apparently composed by, or at least certified by, this man, Ali Effendi, who styles himself the Serdar, or commander of the Mustafazan of Damietta. The Mustafazan are the Janissary garrison that would have guarded the citadel. And it is unusual for an Effendi, which for those of you not familiar with Ottoman titles, it really means a bureaucrat, like a government pen pusher. Unusual for an Effendi to have a military command office, but not unheard of. And this probably was a desk job, a bureaucratic position, going over accounts. To my great surprise, I found that the letter mentions a number of Egyptian grandees with whom I am well familiar from my previous publications. The letter starts by citing a case that Ali's correspondent, Mu'allim Musa, almost certainly the Jewish customs official who would have administered the customs on the behalf, Damietta's customs, this is, on the behalf of the director. It concerns a case that he has against a Christian who is described as Menand Mehmed Aga. That is, he belongs to Mehmed Aga. He's probably a member of his household. He's his client. In support of his case, Mehmed Aga, by the way, is the multezim, the person who held the tax farm of Damietta's customs. Damietta is this port on the Mediterranean, the smallest of the three major Mediterranean ports, Alexandria, Rosetta, which you don't see on the map, and Damietta, and the farthest to the east. The customs in the Ottoman period were really dominated by Jewish officials with the title Mu'allim, or expert. So in support of this case, Mu'allim Musa had obtained letters from, and I'm quoting here, the Emir Yusuf Bey and the Ketkuda al-Waqt and Suleiman Odabasha and Abdullah Odabasha. So Yusuf Bey is Yusuf Bey al-Muslimani. The epithet Muslimani tells us that he was a convert to Islam from Judaism. He's well attested in the Arabic chronicles of Egypt. He held a number of high military positions, including leading a campaign, an Ottoman campaign in either Europe or against Iran, not completely clear which. He was named the director of Damietta's customs in 1705, and as André Raymond has pointed out, this was a reform perpetrated by the Ottoman governor of Egypt in an attempt to take control of Damietta's customs away from the Janissaries. This makes it interesting that the other grandees who seemingly wrote letters in support of Musa were all Janissary officers. The Ketkuda al-Waqt was the acting Ketkuda of the regiment based in Cairo, technically second in command, but really the person running the show. And the two Odabashas, Odabasha is like a lower Janissary officer rank, commander of a barracks or Oda. The two Oda-Bashes are almost certainly from the Kazdala household, the subject of my first book. This household in 1708 was trying to consolidate its control over the entire Janissary regiment. It was still facing some competition within the regiment from other households. I could not identify Mehmed Aga conclusively. He was probably not the Aga of the Janissary regiment based in Cairo. He may have been the Aga, that's the main commander, at least in name, of another regiment. As for Yusuf Bey, the Damietta Customs Directorship was his last post. He died in Damietta in September of 1708. And so it's very tempting to believe, since he was a Jewish convert, that the Siddiq Hadin on the flip side was for him. Mu'allim Musa, in a transport of grief, flipped the letter over and wrote out the Siddiq Hadin in this nice Yemeni hand. No, probably not. Although it is a nice idea. The seal on the opposite side seems to be the seal of Ali Effendi, although it's very hard to read and we can't be sure. In any case, Yusuf Bey's death allowed the Janissaries to take over Damietta's customs again, and they did not relinquish control of it until the French invasion in 1798. And our final document, also from Damietta. It's an inheritance case from only 21 years after the Ottoman conquest in 1517. As you can plainly see, or not, it's clearly from Damietta. The name of Thagar Dumyat, the port of Damietta, appears 3 times in the document. And it is an inheritance case. In terms of the diplomatics, that is the structure of this document, it's very similar to the documents, the inheritance cases from the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem that were worked on by the late Donald Little from the University of Toronto. And here I'll give a shout out to David Powers at Cornell University, because when I was struggling to read this document, and it took me about a month just to decipher it, I realized that it contained a great deal of legal boilerplate, that is just formulaic expression. So I thought what I need is a transcription of a similar court case that will allow me to see what this formulaic language is. So I thought, whom can I ask who knows about Islamic law, pre-modern Islamic law? And I thought, well, David Powers at Cornell. And what he suggested was that I take a look at Donald Little's publications on the Haram al-Sharif. And in my arrogance, I thought I knew Donald Little. I was at conferences with him at which he presented his work on the Haram al-Sharif documents. I don't think it has much to offer me. Boy, was I wrong. In fact, the documents that he examined, and they've also been examined by Huda Lutfi from the American University in Cairo, among others, you can see it looks rather similar. This is an inheritance case from 1391 that he published. The difference you'll immediately notice is that the date on the Mamluk document is up toward the top. Take my word for it. This is from 1391 or 793, whereas in the Ottoman document, it appears right at the end, and the part of the document which Little identified as a Tawqi. Now, if you're a Geniza scholar, and this was true, I worked on the medieval Geniza a very tiny bit at the beginning of my PhD at Princeton. So when I saw this, I thought, well, here's a document that someone did reuse. They turned it sideways and wrote perpendicularly, but in fact, that is part of the document. The Tawqi is a concluding statement in which the judge calls for witnesses to attest to the document's veracity. So the date here is the 10th of Rabi al-Awwal, 945, or the 6th of August, 1538. And I thought, well, this is an Ottoman innovation, because, you know, most of us Ottomanists, when we're reading a document and we want to know the date, we look to the bottom of the document, whether it's a sultanic decree or what have you. But in fact, I've seen similar documents also from the Geniza from the very end of the Mamluk period, like early 1500s. And they also have this tawqi with the date right at the end. So this case came before the Hanbali judge of Damietta, a man named Abdurrahman al-Aksarai. This is surprising for two reasons. First of all, the Hanbali legal right was by far and away the smallest of the four at this time, the four remaining Sunni legal rights. The Hanafi right was the official Ottoman right. I assume this has something to do with Hanbali ruling on inheritance. My attempts to find out what made it distinctive and beneficial to the man trying to get the inheritance is still ongoing. Second, Abdurrahman al-Aksarai is presumably a Turk or the descendant of Turks, probably from the town of Aksaray in central Anatolia, as opposed to the neighborhood of the same name in Istanbul. This I found intriguing, not least because the Hanafi Qadi of the Hanafi judge of Damietta at the same time is known to us because he composed a chronicle of Egypt in Ottoman Turkish. His name was Abdussamad al-Diyarbakri, also a Turk, although one who migrated to Egypt before the Ottoman conquest. And in fact, his chronicle was the focus of Benjamin Lelouch's 2006 book about Ottoman Egypt. So Diyarbakri, I thought, certainly knew al-Aksarai, and therefore I thought maybe he mentioned him in his chronicle. So I contacted Benjamin Lelouch, who's at the University of Paris, and Professor Lelouch went to the trouble of checking not only Diyarbakri's chronicle, but several secondary sources as well. Unfortunately, he found nothing about Abdurrahman al-Aksarai, so he remains a man of mystery. As for the case itself, it involves the estate of a Jewish merchant, Mu'allim Yusuf, there's that Mu'allim title again, almost certainly a Jewish customs official, date and circumstances of death unclear, possibly a shipwreck. His father, Mu'allim Ibrahim, is trying to recoup a portion of his estate, which seems to consist mainly of money and boats, which he has moored in Lake Manzala, apparently, to the east of Damietta. From two brothers, Abu Bakr and Abu Iz, who seem to be merchants in Damietta and probably Yusuf's business partners. These brothers are the sons of the late Badr ad-Din, who is in turn the son of the late Ahmed, also known as Yusuf, or as Yaqub rather, who is identified on the verso as Yaqub ibn Yusuf, the Katib al-Diwan, the Divan Katib of Damietta. So in other words, the scribe of the governor's diwan, and Damietta at the time would have been governed by a Capudan, an admiral, I believe. The verso of this kind of case in the Haram al-Sharif documents, as here, usually details the process of dividing up the state and delivering it to the parties to whom the judge awards it. This part of the procedure usually takes place days or weeks after the initial court case, and accordingly, the recto of the verso of this document is dated 2 Jumad al-Awwal 945, or September 26th, 1538, so about a month and a half after the recto. The verso attests to the division of the estate between Ibrahim, the father of the late Yusuf, and the two brothers, and it was witnessed by the Shafi'i judge of Damietta, Abu Bakr Muhammad Atai, so a good Arab lineage, not a Turk. That is not his seal down at the bottom. It's not al-Aksarai's seal either. I'm still trying to decipher it. Now, the verso includes, in the upper right corner at a 90-degree angle, a statement in Judeo-Arabic, which you see enlarged here, which I initially thought was a witnessing statement. You can see all the Arabic witnessing statements kind of crammed here at the bottom, one even sideways, just I witnessed that this took place. And in fact, it starts with the typical witness formulary, or at least so I thought. Ushahid ala awlad Badr, although he spelled it Bodr. I bear witness to the sons of Badr. However, Alan Elbaum, the incredible research assistant at Princeton's Geniza project, suggested that it was not so much a witness statement as a kind of filing note, and that while ushahid seems to be misspelled, and the Ottoman era Judeo-Arabic hands are really hard to read, but this is Aleph Shin He Aleph Dalet. It seems like whoever wrote it misplaced the second Aleph, but instead it could be Ishhad. So it could be a note that this is the witness statement for, it's the document that the sons of Badr, that is Abu Bakr and Abu Iz, received from the court to get their part of the inheritance. So this indicates that at some point it was part of a family archive, maybe the descendants of Yaqub ibn Yusuf, including these two sons. And then when the last member of the family died out, presumably it would have been placed in the Geniza. Okay, in the interest of time, and since I'm pretty much through discussing what I'm going to discuss about this document, although I could go on and on, I'll go to, oh yes, the document mentions changes in the Ottoman period, which I'll get back to in my conclusions, very tentative conclusions, trying to sum up what we've learned, if anything, from all three documents, or what they can tell us. First of all three of these documents in some capacity concern converts from Judaism to Islam. What seems clear is that Jewish converts to Islam retain some sort of ties to the Jewish community. The death of a convert, as in the case of Yusuf Bey, the customs director of Damietta in the early 18th century, seems to have made these ties visible, or perhaps legible is the word. In addition, converts and their descendants did not necessarily reject all ties to the Jewish community and to their Jewish ancestors, as the case of the brothers Abu Bakr and Abu Iz, the grandsons of a convert who was also a chancery official in Damietta, attests. Their lineage was adduced in court, in a Muslim court, to certify their place in Damietta's society. And of course, they were business partners of a Jewish customs official, son of another Jewish customs official, neither of whom converted. The Damietta court case, which I just discussed, shed some light on the transition from Mamluk to Ottoman rule in Egypt as well at the beginning of the 16th century. The document itself seems to represent a high degree of scribal continuity, at least when it comes to inheritance cases. We have to assume that the Mamluk court scribes remained in place in the early years of Ottoman rule. In addition, the business partnership appears to have bridged the conquest too. And that's where the reference to the changes in the Ottoman era comes in. The language of the document suggests it went back several generations, involving Mu'allim Ibrahim, the father, on the one hand, and Badr ad-Din, the father of the two sons, and Ahmed, the grandfather, who was originally Yaqub, the convert to Islam from Judaism. And finally, Damietta itself. Two of the three documents attest to Ottoman attempts to revive the port as a commercial hub. In response to Crusader attacks on the port and in the 13th century, the Mamluk sultans had razed the original port and rebuilt the city farther inland. Under the Ottomans, it became an important maritime port again, even if it could not compete with Alexandria or maybe even Rosetta. As the late Daniel Panzak has pointed out, the Mediterranean ports handled specific routes and commodities under the Ottomans. Damietta traded with Ottoman Syria and shipping numerous commodities, including rice grown in the Delta villages. So these are just, what I've tried to do here is just to give you a glimpse of the kind of resource these documents can be. And I meant to point out that the ones I've examined are in Arabic script, but most of them are in Judeo-Arabic. So I will thank you and stop there and look forward to questions.